Hello, and welcome to today's Contoural webinar. We're using AI for everything. What are the steps to get ready? First, for some housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded. This recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow. At the end of today's presentation, we'll show a list of upcoming complimentary webinars. If you or any colleagues are interested in joining future sessions, please visit us at contoural.com and select the Events tab to register. We'll also share white papers, blog posts, and articles we've recently published. We invite you to complete our brief post-event survey. We truly value and appreciate your feedback. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us at info@contoural.com. And now allow me to introduce today's speakers, Tom Mighell, COO of Contoural, and Mark Diamond, Contoural President and CEO.
Thank you very much. Tom, I'm going to introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tom. As Chloe said, I'm Chief Operating Officer at Contoural. I spend a lot of time talking with organizations kind of about what they're doing nowadays with AI and how they need to start thinking about managing it. And it all starts with information governance, as we'll talk about today.
And I'm Mark Diamond, CEO of Contoural. I think many of you know us. We're the largest independent provider of information governance, AI readiness, and privacy strategic consulting services. And just a reminder, we do talk about products, but we do not sell any products. Matter of fact, we don't do any reactivity discovery. We don't store any documents. And we don't even take any referral fees. So our discussion about whatever products or technologies is our opinion and just our opinion. We're not looking to have something hidden in our back pocket that we're trying to sell you from a product perspective. We're a pure strategic consulting services vendor. So a couple things that we're seeing out there in the world of AI. So I think, last year, a lot of companies were beginning to look at ChatGPT and they're saying, what is this and how can we use this and how's it happening? And we're really seeing a shift as we go into 2026 and plans for 2027. Companies are now really looking to integrate the use of generative AI in many different parts of the business. In some cases, it's a mandate by the CEO where she or he is saying, we will be using AI, and we're going to be using it lots of different places. Now, if you're an in-house counsel or an information governance professional or risk or privacy or compliance or IT, you may be asking yourself a lot of questions. How will we be using it? And are we going to be using it okay for the right countries? And some of you may ask, how do we make sure we're not leaking confidential information? What framework do we use? Or how do we make sure that we're okay? And do we need to do that ahead of time? Who's going to manage all of this? Will it be accurate? I mean, all these questions begin swirling around. And to be honest, when you hear that you're going to be using AI sort of everywhere, it becomes a little bit overwhelming out there. And so today we're going to really talk about how do we take this very complex, overwhelming situation and simplify it and make it easier so we can be compliant and reduce risk and ensure safety and all the good things that we want to do when we're using generative AI, and make sure that we're doing that smart and accurately. And so again, we do see a lot of organizations sort of struggling with this, and this is what we want to do. And here's one of the drivers behind it. So sometimes to say we're going to be using AI, you may ask yourself, okay, what are the laws out there? And obviously the EU has laws, although these are being changed as we speak. There's different laws between Korea and China and Singapore and Brazil. Many different countries are coming out with many different laws. And it's very easy to take a fairly significant deep dive on all the new and pending AI legislation out there. That's almost a full-time job. And it's not just national laws. It's, if you're in the US, a number of state laws. California, actually literally last week updating these. Texas and New York, and sometimes there's industry specific state guidance, or Utah has some of this. In some cases, Colorado a couple weeks ago repealed its high-risk AI systems. And so you could spend all day looking at the emerging state legislation. A lot of organizations are looking at frameworks, and there's the NIST framework, which is based on risk, and another one, a pretty good one from MIT, and there's ISO, and You could spend days looking at just what the frameworks are, and then you begin to realize, well, we need an AI policy, and how do we do the AI policy with the first three? And then there's this dashboards out there. Do we need to buy one of these tools? You can buy a tool that helps us to be able to do that. And then by the way, who should be involved? I mean, what is it, just me, or we have a larger group of people? Who's the right group of people involved? And I'm going to say this up front. If you start going down this path, it becomes incredibly overwhelming, and in our view, turns into a bit of a muddle. These are different areas, different frameworks applying to different areas, different laws. And if you sort of try and create this grand overarching strategy, I mean, you could get bogged down for months and quarters just trying to do this strategy. And meanwhile, your organization is on its path to implementing generative AI, and then you're going to be in catch-up mode. So we want to sort of clear away some of the confusion that we're seeing in terms of how organizations are using AI and what's a bit of a smarter approach. And to do that, we think there's some do's and don'ts. Tom, walk us through. What at a high level, what are some do's and don'ts in your opinion in terms of organizations that want to use generative AI?
So what you see here on this slide really boils down to two different main things to do. One do and one don't that I want to focus on. The don't is the most important at the top, which is don't attempt to build a top-down governance program around a framework. Based on all of the muddle that you saw just now, trying to build this overarching program based around all that right now is going to be a mess. But what we think you should do is almost building it from the top up, from the bottom up. Start with specific use cases. Look at the who, what data is impacted, what actions, what are we going to be doing? And then you build that governance use case by use case and repeatable process over repeatable process. And then as you start to gather use cases, you'll be able to then understand, all right, which laws apply, make sure that we're compliant with them. Don't worry about AI requirements that aren't relevant to your use case, because there's a lot out there that may have nothing to do with what you want to do with AI. So figure out what you want to do, what you plan to do with AI, and build upwards from there to develop those individual use cases, and then over time, the governance and repeatable processes that are part of those use cases.
Again, you'll hear from vendors, hey, just buy our dashboard tool and we'll get you, right away, we'll get you full governance. And you'll hear from others saying, hey, we can track every bit of data out there. And I would be careful. While the idea of just installing a tool and having everything governed right off the bat is very appealing, as we'll walk through here, we think that's misleading and won't necessarily allow you to your objectives of what you want to do to be AI ready or for AI governance. Speaking of which, so what are we trying to do when we talk about AI governance? What are the areas that we think that organizations need to focus on? And the first one is obviously global AI compliance and privacy rules. Using generative AI, decisions on involving personal information, or decisions on individuals, or actually going out there and in certain use cases. Well, again, as we said, there's sort of a patchwork of emerging regulation out there, but we obviously want to look at our use case and make sure that we're compliant with the laws. The next large area is your data quality. And we'll talk about this, how we think data quality is a big driver of using generative AI with something called RAG, which we'll talk about. But this is often really key to successful use of this. If we use it, we don't want to give away sensitive information, either inadvertently give away personal information or corporate confidential information. We may not want large language models training off of our data. And this third one is obviously related to the first two. Obviously we don't want to breach data or present data, and it goes hand in hand with data quality. We want to make sure that we're ethical and transparent. We're using it in a way that is ethical, and we're letting people know how we're using it. And finally, goes without saying, we have to go through the steps to make sure we're accurate, correct, and safety. And so we think we like to simplify things. We think that if you look at your use of generative AI along these 5 drivers, that this is going to be really the best way to approach it. And again, we'll bring in potentially the frameworks or the tools or other things later on, but we think this is the right level to start with. Now, Tom, one of the questions organizations have is, do we need an AI policy? But as they start to generate the AI policy, they notice that there's a lot of crossover, if you will, with existing policies. Do we create one grand AI policy? Do we need an AI policy? Do we create a grand AI policy, or is that policy more of a coordinator, if you will, with other existing policies that we update?
So I think that the answer almost always is going to be strengthen your existing. Even if you end up creating an AI policy, there will be elements of AI that are going to apply to everything you see there on the right side of the screen. So you're probably going to have to some extent, update those policies anyway. So why not start there? You've already got them, you already have them. Make sure that you're covering them appropriately. Oftentimes, what you might find is that that you cover most of what would be in an AI policy across all of these, because they actually get covered to some extent in all of them. But then if you find, well, we really want to talk about how we plan to use AI and specific rules around doing that, use it as the connector. Use it as the connector between all of these, and not as a standalone. We've talked about in other webinars how you have the potential to have conflicting policies if you try to manage the same things in what is effectively kind of an information governance area. So make sure that it stands by itself, but is a connector, so that you better avoid the conflict between what might be in those other policies.
Tom, we have a question that says, we have existing policies, but we're also putting a lot of this information in our AI governance policy, in part because we want to be fully covered. What do you think about that? Is it okay to have some duplication between these two?
I mean, I guess it depends on the extent that there's any conflict between the two. If you're saying one thing in your privacy policy, but you're saying a different thing in your AI policy, obviously that's a problem. I think that I personally would prefer an AI policy that refers out to certain areas, but if you're including refers out to certain policies. Every policy usually has a reference table that's included in it. But if you feel like it needs to be there just for presence so people can see it, I don't really have an issue with duplicating it, as long as there's a reference to say, this is part of our organization's records policy or ethics policy. But I don't know that it's necessary.
Okay. And we're always wary about you never want competing policies, because that's an invitation for non-compliance, because inevitably you're going to have something that competes. We'd rather see it in just one place out there. All right. So I'm going to walk through the way we think to look at it. And we talked about use cases. And these are most of the generalized use cases. We don't want to say this is it. And we've somewhat ordered these from basic to sophisticated, although in many cases, companies and other organizations may jump between them. This isn't necessarily a linear progression as you go down for that. But let me walk through there. So today, there are a lot of vendors that actually are using, I'll call old-fashioned machine learning, that they're saying, hey, we use AI. And that's not necessarily new. And this can be enterprise search or DLP or content analytics. And they've been around for many years. A lot of times we don't necessarily think there's a lot of governance around there. Now, there can be some exceptions on this, and this gets a little bit complicated. For example, the EU doesn't want you using AI for decisions about individuals. Well, but you've been doing that for years for some of these machine learning applications. Does that mean that this retroactively applies back to, existing applications that you've been using for years? It's sort of a special case that needs to be looked at, but we don't worry about that too much. Now, most organizations have been introduced to using generative AI, through ad hoc, ChatGPT, Gemini, other things like that. And this is typically ad hoc or ungoverned, but this is where the governance starts. We really want to be careful on that. The next level is using assistive AI but accessing enterprise data. So if you use Copilot, that's a good example. Copilot has access to lots of data within your environment, which could be very helpful, or it could be problematic. Same Google Workspace or AI Zoom. And so we want to watch that. Again, we're going to go through these use cases in details. You may be, in many cases, pulling in, AI already through existing third-party applications. If you use DocuSign, we're using AI. Well, or ERP or CRM or contract management. We do want to ask some questions. How are they using AI? How are they accessing our data? I get a little worried just assuming it will be okay, but there's a huge rush among legacy vendors to embed AI. And as I said previously, sometimes this is just rebranding machine learning that's already been there, but in some cases it's really use of generative AI. So we need to watch that. Now we're getting more sophisticated, internally built simple AI applications. The vibe code, what they call vibe code, which is no code or low code Copilot, internal assistance, task specific tools, other things like that, where we're using AI to actually build applications. And it's actually getting pretty darn simple to do that. And so we see these often done in business units. They may not announce that they're doing that, again, because they're pretty quick and easy to do, but that's something we need to look at. Then we move on up to more advanced applications, connect to enterprise data, business process workflows, call center, engineering, life sciences. Was just talking to a company yesterday that was talking about how they're really integrating AI. They're building the application and they're making calls out to the large language model to be able to do this. This is for strategic initiatives, but what they're quickly finding is that sometimes this can be hindered by data quality. We'll talk about that. And then finally, the next step on that is enabling AI agents to take action. These are agents that trigger tasks, route work, update systems, access their own data, and there's great promise with these. Copilot, E7 on that is going to, Microsoft version E7 is going to great promise that with also great risk. And again, just I'm trying to be plain spoken. What is agentic AI? Well, you may use AI, for example, to, hey, find me. I have to go to Chicago, find out what's the best flight, what's the best hotel, how do I get this all synced up and report back to me? Agentic AI is, I'm going to go to Chicago, please find this out and book the tickets for me. In this case, you're actually enabling AI to do stuff for me or book the hotel reservations. That's agentic AI. And again, your use may vary, and it may vary across the organization. And again, you may not do all of these, and sometimes you'll skip ahead, but these are all, when we look at AI governance, or more specifically AI readiness, we like to look at individual use cases. Because there's no, if all we're doing is using, Copilot, or even ChatGPT, do we really need to look at agentic AI actions yet? Probably not. So let's not make it overly complicated. And Tom, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Nope.
All right. I'll cover this briefly. Organizations are using machine learning right now, content classification, DLP. There may be limitations on using ML on stuff that was previously not regulated, but now may be regulated. We really want to look how we're using ML for regulated, including employment, insurance, and healthcare out there. We want to make sure if we're using machine learning that we have the appropriate security and access controls in place, and how we manage that. We also want to be in our use and ethical and transparent. And obviously we have to do good testing on that. And so we're throughout this presentation going to present some readiness checklists. If you're using machine learning, we probably want to have an AI governance policy. We want to make sure that we do the use case review for regulated activities to make sure that, is there something more that we should apply to this? We have to make sure our security and access processes and controls are in place. And then obviously we want a well-defined and documented test and audit process. Even if you've been using machine learning, this may be a good way to say, hey, let's try this use case out there. And again, I don't expect a lot of surprises with this, but be careful, because in some cases, what was not regulated before now may be regulated, And the regulations may be really aimed at generative AI, but they may be non-specific enough to also cover machine learning. Right, Tom, talk us about AI chat tools. And this is when we talk about uses of generative AI, this is how most organizations are really getting in initially to generative AI.
Right. This is usually the entry level where what we see, and where likely your employees are already using it. They're either the free version or they've got their own account, or it may be that your company has given that account to them. But what it ends up being is it ends up being ad hoc. It's not controlled. It's not governed in any way. It is help me do my job, and it's going to differ from use case to use case. I think the biggest risk that you find here is going to be around the leakage of sensitive information. The fact that, and we've seen in the past where I believe Samsung IT developers placed Samsung code out into ChatGPT, which became part of ChatGPT's learning engine. They took it all. You can very easily get caught up in giving it sensitive information because it provides information to you that's useful to you. I think also an area where it's an issue is in what we would call those regulated decisions, hiring decisions, lending, whether to make a loan to somebody. I think that in those types of things, we're seeing a lot of concern around using AI tools to be able to do that. So those are the main issues. When we think about the readiness for working with chatbots, it doesn't change tremendously from machine learning. You still want to have that AI governance policy. You want to start having a data security classification standard at this point. You want to be able to have employees tell you, have employees be able to understand what is sensitive information, what's public, what's internal, what are we able to share. Your data security classification standard will let people know what could we share with a chatbot, if anything. Usually the answer is going to be very little, if nothing, but a data security classification standard will help you determine that. AI training, making sure that everyone understands the appropriate use of these particular tools, and then to the extent necessary, because there are some tools within Claude and ChatGPT that allow the tools to take over your computer. You want to make sure that you have the right configuration processes to make sure that none of these tools get unauthorized access to any of your systems or repositories.
We have a question here. How can we determine if these policies would be applicable to internally developed applications? We're going to talk about internally developed applications. So what you're going to find is that we want you to start by looking at this at individual use cases, and we're using AI chat tools or other, and we're going to go through more sophisticated use cases as we build up on this. And in many cases, you will find either the policies or the processes or the standards that you've developed for one use case will be applicable for another. And eventually, you're going to have a repeatable process, but we'd rather see you build that repeatable process based on your actual bottom-up use cases versus trying to imagine what the AI world will look like in 2 years and have this overarching program that it's very easy to be able to get stuck on. So that's we think that's the best practice because we're seeing a lot of organizations get stuck. I also want to refer to another best practice here, which is who should be involved. Should we have legal and IT and technology and privacy and information security involved in the business units? Yes. We do want multiple stakeholders on this, and sometimes, well, let me do this and I'll get back to you, or, we don't think that's a good approach for being able to do that. But what we, at the same time, hand in hand with that, is that we all have a role. If you're on the legal side of the house, your job is to help explain some of the legal and regulatory requirements and some of your EU rules to maybe some of your technology folks or some of the business units. If you're on the IT side of the house, how can we, in a plain spoken way, explain how we're using the technology? We think this ability to communicate internally and be plain spoken is really important to be able to do that, because most of the mistakes we're seeing is when people assume something or they didn't understand it. And likewise, if somebody's talking about some technology you don't understand, it's okay to raise your hand and say, can you explain this to me? I'm not quite sure I get this. The more plain spoken we can be, and I know sometimes it's tough to explain technology in a plain spoken way, or sometimes it's difficult to explain regulatory requirements, but but as we all know, the practice of being plain spoken not only helps the people we're explaining it to, sometimes it helps us understand too. So we really want to, work as a team and be plain spoken in these areas. All right, Tom, how about Copilot? A lot of organizations are using Copilot or Gemini or other ones like that. What do we need to do to be compliant and ready to govern this well?
This is a really interesting one, because this is where companies can start to feel at least a little bit more secure, because this is a tool that's being used internally, but there's still concerns that you need to have. It's not that your employees are using a tool outside for ad hoc purposes, but it's actually something that's built into the tools they usually have. Now, I'm going to spend more time talking about Copilot, because the tools around that and for managing information around that tend to be a little bit more robust than what Google has for its workspace. But these are tools that are embedded. I pull up Microsoft 365 and I pull up Word and it lets me edit a document. I pull up Excel and it lets me create a huge data set with lots of tables, because I really stink at Excel. Where what really is going to do the heavy lifting here is having your internal information governance program largely in place. This is where having sensitivity labels and retention labels are going to be important, because this is going to, for example, Copilot goes and it looks at everything that's out in your Microsoft 365 environment. So email and SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive and all the locations where it might be. That's why having your retention schedule implemented, having a data placement strategy in place, and being ready to talk about all of that with your AI people is really important. We'll add to the governance policy having an updated retention schedule. Are you making sure that you don't have a lot of rot, a lot of redundant, obsolete, and trivial information out there that could be training Copilot or Gemini, for that matter, on bad information? Is your schedule up to date? Make sure that data security classification standard is there, because you still don't want to feed even an internal tool really confidential or sensitive information. To be able to do this, you want to implement your retention labels across all of your Microsoft 365 tenants. You want to have sensitivity labels to automate all of your data security classifications. And again, it goes without saying that people need to be trained on using Copilot, the appropriate ways to use it, and what to avoid.
My favorite example of this, where misuse of this is, and we've seen this happen, where there's not good data security classification. Suppose I'm Mark and I have access to Copilot and I want to get a raise, and I'll say, "Hey, Copilot, can you write something on why I should get a raise, and how can I make more money than other people?" And we've seen, without proper data security classification implemented, this happens. Oh, I know what Tom's salary is, and this is what Mark's making, and before you know it, it's accessing all of this very sensitive information, corporate confidential information, because the right information security labels were not applied. And it, by the way, doesn't have to necessarily go to the HR database. It's, the email, the files, other things like that. This stuff lives out there. And before you know it, it's obviously leaking very sensitive information internally. Oh, this is what Tom makes, and this is what Mark makes, and we really want to be careful about this. And so we are seeing a lot of organizations really take a very serious look at their data security classification, make sure that we apply the right controls to this in the right way, because this is important if we want to use it. Tom, talk a little bit about, you mentioned a data security classification standard. What is in a data security classification standard?
Well, it's interesting, because a lot of organizations think that they have the standards, and what they really have is that IT identified, for example, 4 levels of security. We have our public information that anybody can see, our internal use only that generally anybody can see. Then we have levels of confidential and restricted, depending on who gets to see them both inside and outside the company. And most companies, their IT departments have set those nominal categories, but they haven't really defined what goes there or what gets included in them, or how to handle information at each level, because you're going to handle public information very differently than you're going to handle restricted information. So what we've been talking about with data security classification is that if you are able to classify information based on its security level, you stand a much better chance of only giving AI information that it should be entitled to have. If there is a corporate decision that restricted information, that our sensitive financial information about my and Mark's salaries should not be discoverable, then that gets applied with the highest priority, highest security level, and AI doesn't touch it because you train your AI and say, AI, you only have the access to these particular areas. That's why being able to identify what your standards are and how to treat information across all those standards is critical. I would say it's critical to everything in information governance, but now that we're with AI, it's just another reason to have a robust standard.
A lot of the information security, and I'm going to be a little bit unfair here, a lot of the information security efforts often apply to structured data that lives in databases. A huge amount of sensitive information lives in unstructured data and email. You may not think that, but it does. And in the aggregate, it can actually reveal quite a bit about a company, and in a way that you don't want to. So we want to be very careful on that. All right. Moving down in sophistication, another use case is maybe some applications you're using now, SAP or ServiceNow, or as I mentioned, DocuSign, other things like that, have suddenly built AI into their application. And this could HR credit, and there are rules around this, and especially as we start looking at, for example, HR data subject to bias and disparate impact analyses, other things like that. We really want to make sure that we're governing our input data on that for access controls, and we're preventing leakage of sensitive information. A lot of times, not all of them, but a lot of these applications have tools to be able to restrict and manage it, but we found some cases where these controls were not applied. Oh, I didn't know we were supposed to do that. Again, we sort of assume one day using DocuSign, it has this AI capability, must be okay. And when you go dig down, you're going, oh, there's some stuff that we need to be able to do. And so we obviously want to use it ethically out there. Special care and training when using agents, connectors. We've seen a number of organizations that now have very specific SLAs with their vendors that they use. Sometimes they have zero data retention, which basically means you can access your data, but you can save zero of it, and you have to make sure that that's in place. Again, we're getting there. You would think that, but it's still a bit of the Wild West because so many of these vendors are afraid about becoming obsolete. So they're moving very, very quickly to become a generative AI enabled. And what we need is, again, governance policy. We talked about updated data security classification standards. We may well need updated privacy policies and processes, as well as look at our personal data inventory and how personal data flows. Because sometimes we think these applications don't have access to personal information when they indeed do. And I alluded to, the data processing SLAs that you have with the vendors, and likewise make sure that in many cases we're going to want zero data retention. Look at this stuff. And again, we don't want to make it overwhelming, and we especially don't want to say, here's our grand overarching strategy and how do we, it's okay to take this on an application by application basis, but these are important questions to be able to ask. When we talk about this, the other thing is that the ethical use. A lot of organizations already have ethics policies in place, and there's been some argument that we need new ethics for generative AI. We sort of disagree with that. We want to make sure that we're not using AI that discriminates on people. The easiest example in that is we all of a sudden start using AI to help us look for candidates when hiring people. And we may give it a lot of data of our existing engineers, for example, and we want to make sure that AI is looking at individuals based on their education background, their technology experience, a number of other factors. We want to make sure it doesn't choose candidates because, oh, you have a bunch of white males. I guess we need to look for white males. I don't think the risk is that we need to say, hey, we want to, we're obviously don't have, we're open in our hiring and we don't discriminate. I think we just need to check to make sure that we're not doing that in our biases. And the same thing applies to transparency and accountancy and privacy ethics. we're seeing more organizations actually just going and revisiting their ethics policies and making sure they're up to date versus trying to set a new set of ethics policies for AI and then making sure that we apply those the right way. Again, our goal here is to make things simpler and easier and hence more compliant and easier to implement and check. The next area is internally built simple AI applications. And you can use AI to develop AI applications. We do this at Contoural. We have AI applications that we develop internally. But let's make sure how we're using it. Application specific based on the type of application, the use of personal information. Make sure that we're never providing it, confidential client information in the course of Contoural or other information like that. So many internal applications use something called RAG, and I will talk about that in a second. And there is a real risk for data leakage on this if we're not careful. Now we're building our own applications. We're going to argue that there's a higher bar on us for transparency. And that transparency now rests with the internal developer. There's stories about, for example, an airline in Canada put a chatbot out. They built a chatbot, and somebody asked, "Hey, I'm going to a funeral. Do I get a bereavement fare?" And the chatbot mistakenly said, "Oh, it's okay. Just tell us afterward, and we'll give you a rebate." Well, that was wrong. He went for the rebate, and the airline said, "No, we're not going to give that to you." And he said, "But you told them." And he was smart enough to screen capture what the chatbot told him. Brought it to court, and the airline argued, "Well, that wasn't us. That was the chatbot." No. The Canadian court, pretty easy decision to say, no, you're going to be held responsible for what you say. And likewise, you need to be ethical and transparent on this. And so really the accuracy, the correctness, and safety is a higher bar. So we need, again, I'm going to go back to the checklist, AI governance policy, updated records retention schedule. We're going to talk about why in a second, updated data security classification. And then we really want to think about AI development lifecycle processes. How are we developing this? What are we doing? Who's gonna oversee this? Potentially updated privacy policy. And then this is where the testing and auditing processes really come in. How did we test it? Again, when you build it, it looks like it works right away. Maybe not. And this is where good testing comes in. And that hasn't changed. I mean, the having the right testing. And this is also where we really need to establish human in the loop controls. Not to say that human in the loop controls only are at this use case that we're beginning, that could be in other use cases, but in particular, this use case, this is where human in the loop controls come up. Now, when we talk about data quality, let me give a very simple example on this and where data quality becomes a big issue. If you're using generative AI today, and I'm using ChatGPT, and I'm depending on the training data that OpenAI, or maybe I'm using Anthropic, that Claude finds, or maybe I'm using, pick your favorite large language model, again, this AI engine that we use. We're sort of using what I'll call off-the-shelf training data. And sometimes that training data or the large language model, for lack of a better term, is just dumb. I mean, just really dumb stuff. What's an example of that? Suppose I'm in marketing and I say, hey, can you create me an image of a wristwatch? And if you go to ChatGPT and say, create me an image of a wristwatch and put the time, by the way, I want the time of the wristwatch at 1:01. And ChatGPT comes back with this image and you're going, oh, no. First of all, you put the date field at 1:01 and the time says 1:56. ChatGPT, redo the image and, give me the time at 1:56 and not 1:01. And ChatGPT comes back and gives you the same image with the time at 1:56. What the heck's going on here? Why? Times like this, you realize, how these seemingly smart large language models are actually pretty dumb. What's really going on is all of the images of wristwatch, it's learned from websites, or the vast majority of them, from companies that are trying to sell wristwatch. And if you're trying to sell a wristwatch, having the time at 1:56 is a much sexier way of doing it. And the large language model just does not get it, because it has bad training data. So the The bad training data becomes a big issue as you start building your own application. So what organizations are doing is they're feeding their own data into the large language model. Maybe you're doing contracts. Hey, write me a contract, but I want to give you our standard contract terms. I don't want you to find any old standard contracts off the web. I want to give you our terms. Maybe you're doing engineering. Hey, I'm going to give the engineering data. Maybe you're life sciences. Hey, you've got years of very valuable clinical data. We will feed you the large language model or clinical data. And this can be a very powerful way of using it. Except, how do we make sure we're giving it high quality information and not, failed clinical trials, or at least we don't tell it was a failed clinical trial, or old versions of a contract, or other contracts that we may have that we didn't use. There's all these different examples. Or how do we make sure that we're not inadvertently giving it, without the proper controls and protection, trade secrets? Tom gave the example of the group that gave source code. That was, are we giving away our trade secrets in that? And so this whole process where we feed it is called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And to do it well, we have to have good data quality. And that's really important. How do we drive data quality to feed generative AI? Well, actually, driving data quality is a records management problem. Well, this is who would have thunk? Identifying high value information, getting rid of low value or expired information, and in the larger information governance lens, applying appropriate data security classification, not only to structured data, but to unstructured data, files and emails, and all the way across this is what we do. And so a good modern records management program goes an awful long way to driving good quality data. I have one client, she runs both privacy and records management in a very large global engineering firm. And she told me she's popular. And the reason is because all the business units want to use RAG. Well, they want to use generative AI, and they want to use RAG, and they want to delete a lot of stuff, but they don't know if they can delete it. Who would have thought that the business units are eager to delete stuff, but it's happening. So they want to delete a lot of stuff, but they want to make sure it's okay to delete. And so now they're going back to the records policies, and records management is potentially a very important driver to this, to making it work. And I'm just going to cover this briefly. We have talked about this in other Contoural webinars, but we're seeing organizations that are now really driving classification of their emails and files, not only for retention, but for data security classification, and getting rid of the old, unneeded, low value, expired information. And they're doing this through automation. You can teach Microsoft 365, so what we call the 5-second rule, where you drag and drop files. And for example, I'm a finance person. If I've got a journal and ledger record, and this is a very simplified example for a single individual, and I drag it over there, the system, SharePoint, will automatically apply retention, and SharePoint will apply sensitivity labels and access controls. Setting it up this way really frees you up not only use Copilot, but if you want to use RAG, technically you could argue Copilot is a type of RAG, or more sophisticated applications, because we're getting all of the data properly classified. And so, again, this is a longer conversation, and happy to talk to you more about this strategy. We've talked about this in other webinars, but we're seeing a lot of organizations move towards this. All right, Tom, talk a little bit more about internally built AI applications, some of the ones out there.
So we've talked about the internally.
I'm sorry, go on.
We've talked about the internally built simple AI applications. What makes these, I think, more complex is that they're harder to validate. The simple ones are easier to understand what they do, how they do it, what's going on. They tend to draw information in a different way, but they have essentially the same risks. So they're going to have the same risks as you would have seen on the other slide, but they will be amplified, I think. I think that a lot of organizations are starting to use some advanced AI tools to make critical business decisions, and they have to be advanced to do that. So you're sort of raising the stakes automatically, because because you are doing this in the use cases here tend to be more advanced and more business critical than what you're doing the simple AI tools for. The readiness for this, most everything on here is the same, except you're going to add really two main things that would be different. Because you're doing advanced AI development, you've got a lifecycle process you need to manage now. You need to essentially treat this the same way that your IT department's treating software development, and there needs to be some management of how that tool is being developed, because it's a lot more than just vibe coding and telling a tool to build something. There's a lot more to it, and it needs to be managed appropriately. And then finally, the other one that to add here on the readiness is human in the loop. Make sure that, we want to hope that there's human in the loop in everything we've been talking about, but this is really where it becomes more important, because the more advanced you get, the more opportunities you have to have issues. So developing and implementing a process where the accuracy, the quality, everything is checked by a human as part of it really needs to be built into your readiness checklist.
Some of me asking, hey, AI is scary, it can hallucinate. How do we make sure it doesn't hallucinate? How do we make sure it's accurate? I'm going to show you this plan, and I'm going to date myself. This is interesting. Some things on AI are very new, but making sure we're accurate, correctness, and safety. I could have written this or seen this either when I was I'm going to date myself, a computer science student and a software engineer in the mid 80s. In the late 80s. I mean, this is nothing new. This is standard software engineering life cycle that we want to make sure that we apply, where we develop a plan, we execute, we continue testing. This is nothing really new, that we have appropriate test data called evals that we can go this against. The risk is that we think AI is new and it's different, or it looks like it works, and we have to continue the diligence. I mean, if you were putting out a new application to process credit cards, you would test it. Now you need to have that same discipline, even though it's easier to do that. And so this is where these come into play. And the final area is enabling AI agents to take action. And this is, again, what I talked about previously. Agentic AI is where AI not only provides us information, we give it the tools and we tell it to do these tasks to complete these tools. And again, it's very powerful, but it also can go the wrong way. There's a story recently about a car rental company. This is a smaller one, where they turned on agentic AI and it was going great until they realized that agentic AI had deleted the next 3 months of rental reservations, and also deleted the backups. I should say that is not. I'm going to argue that's not an AI issue. That was a huge engineering issue. That was a human fault to let your agentic AI to be able to do that. But again, we have to look at input quality, preventage of leakage of sensitive information, make sure it's ethical and correct. Checklist, AI governance, review the ethics policy, updated the records retention schedule, make sure we have the testing. All these pieces that we put together. And they obviously build on themselves. Now, if you're not using agentic AI, part of our advice today is let's have this in the back of mind, but let's focus on the use cases that we do care about today. Again, it's easy to say, oh, we need this overarching AI governance policy and how we can handle agentic AI. Where are we using agentic AI yet? No. Okay, so let's cover the more basic use cases first. We can always expand it later to do that, and that will work. And the lessons learned on the simpler use cases, we think, will go a long way to making this stuff work. And so again, break it into pieces, make it simpler. And you may be saying, what about the NIST framework? NIST framework is really good for identifying risk. It's not so good for other things. What about the MIT framework? What about the EU rules? These are all useful tools to pull in to be able to do it, but it's but again, let's look at what we need first, and then we can use the tools to be able to support our decisions. Not saying, hey, if we've got a fully implemented NIST framework, we're going to be okay, because you won't, because NIST really looks at risk, but it ignores a lot of other things. And we want to make sure we start with the right focus, big picture view. Tom, I know this is a big issue for you. Once we get it, and you alluded to this, we have to monitor.
Well, and this really shouldn't look any different than if you've been to our webinars before. We talk about this all the time. It's not enough to say, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it, but here's how we check that we're supposed to be doing this properly. How do we actually do this appropriately? There have to be processes and procedures built in to monitor everything that you're making sure. Part of this is guarding against the possibility and sometimes probability that AI will be wrong, that there will be errors, that there will be issues. How do we guarantee that safety and correctness is happening? How do we, if there is an issue, how do we fix it? And how do we document that we fixed it? Will there be, similar to data breach laws, will there be laws where organizations are going to be required to respond if they've had some sort of AI incident that requires remediation that needs to be publicly disclosed? We're not really to the point right now where regulators are clamoring to know about our AI, but really accountability and transparency into what you do is going to be more and more important over time. The states are beginning to pass more laws. Unclear how that's going to work out, but it may not matter so much that you're showing a regulator, but it may depend on what you show to your clients or your customers. They're going to care that there's not just a black box that's sitting there that's doing all these magical things, and understanding how you do things if people have questions about it helps very much with customer relationship and with having a good reputation. Not any different from maintaining a good information governance program. Make sure you're documenting everything you do, and that you're able to show, here's why we did what we did and how it all works.
One of there's a lot of vendors that have these AI dashboards. And to be honest, I'm not really, I guess it says in the slide, I'm not a fan of these. The idea is load my dashboard and we can specify which frameworks we want to use, and then we'll just sort of check the box and being able to do that. And yes, these dashboards can help you understand legal and regulatory requirements by country, although most times they just list the regulatory requirement. They don't actually explain how it's applied out there. And sometimes they can be a repository, and this may be useful for in-house applications. But in that case, it's just a listing of the applications. What they don't really address is how are we using generative AI? What are the larger and smaller risks? Do the applications access personal information? What's the provenance of the data source? Where are we getting our data? Are we using RAG? How do we make sure we have data quality? How do we test? They may have a box. Have you tested? Check. Okay, you're good. No, that's not really going to cut it. And likewise, what's the risk we're having? And is it appropriate for our organization? And as Tom alluded to, what do our clients expect? And so, again, I know this is overwhelming, and I know this is something new. And the temptation is, hey, if I can show the regulators my dashboard, I'm going to be okay. No, you actually may not, because your dashboard on the surface may be answering these questions, but with a little inspection, it could be very problematic. And we also think having these dashboards doesn't really, part of what you want to do, and we alluded to this, is we go through use case to use case through use case, you develop this AI readiness agility. And then as new use cases develop, you're all the better to handle it. These dashboards don't foster that. And we want you to think about this, not get overwhelmed by it. And the more you think about it, the better you're going to be, and the better prepared you're going to be. So again, vendors don't like me when I say this. Some vendors don't like me when I say this, but we're not careful on the idea of a check the box dashboard. And likewise, ones that claim I'll track all your personal information. No, they don't. But we happen to talk about that line. So, summary. Develop AI readiness for your level of AI maturity. And again, it could jump around a little bit, but focus on what you're doing. Use AI governance principles, frameworks, and risk models to ensure that you're asking the right questions. Don't make your governance, your readiness focused on the framework, but rather, and some of these are actually pretty good because they help you think consider things you haven't really thought about. And so there is value in them, but not exclusively in there. Set aside and deprioritize what you're not doing. There's a lot of discussion on how do we, on compliance issues that only apply to large language model developers. And they're fun topics to talk about at conference, but unless you're developing a large language model, and 99.99% of those of you are not, interesting to listen to, but let's not worry about these. We talked about having this as a team exercise. Be comfortable at asking the right questions on how the technology is used. Be quicker to explain legal and regulatory requirements to the technology team, and vice versa. Ask them questions. And if you don't understand, come back to saying, hey, I don't get this. And nothing about AI is so inherently complicated that, at least at a high level, it's not explainable. And it's that old saw that, if somebody can't explain something, chances in a plain way, chances are they probably don't understand it well enough. And so asking those questions are good. And again, well-developed AI readiness elements for basic use cases are really a springboard as you go out towards more advanced use cases, and it gets you in the mode. And that's what we find is effective. Most important, if your CEO says, hey, we want to use AI for everything, or we want to be able to do this, you'll be in a position as a governance professional, as a compliance professional, as a legal professional, as an information security professional, IT professional, to be able to meet what your company needs. You won't be saying, no, we can't do this. You'll actually be helping your company adopt and use generative AI, but in a very clear, compliant, safe, all the good things we want way, and which will be a huge enabler. It'll work for your organization. Real briefly, we help organizations with AI readiness, with information governance, privacy consulting services. We do a lot of work around AI assessments. We also develop records retention schedule. We do data quality, implementation, classification, a very wide set of services. I think most of you know us. We work with 30% of the Fortune 500, many very small, medium-sized enterprises, and actually a fair amount of nonprofit as well as public sector. So we help organizations doing this. One thing that is actually very popular, we're doing quite a few of these, we offer a virtual in-house governance seminar. Now, this is a seminar that we present just to your company or organization. And we can customize it. We can focus on AI. We can focus on the governance areas on there. It's an hour. It's done virtually. We can even offer CLE credit, although typically the attendees, are much wider. And this is not a sales pitch for us. We can give you lots of references. This is pure content. And we'll cover some of the things we talked about here. And because it's easy, it's an hour, we don't charge for it. You're smart enough. If we say smart things, you're smart enough to realize that we may be of value sometime in the future. And even if you don't plan on using it, happy to be able to do. These are easy. They're fast for us to do. So if you're interested in the virtual seminar, email us at info@contoural.com, or just want to find out more. And again, you don't have to be a Contoural client or there's no commitment you be Contoural compliant. These, just not overthink it, pretty easy for us to do. And likewise, we're doing a number of peer exchanges out there. I'm checking to see, we have one last question out there. Who or how is AI maturity level determined? Well, we like to break down AI maturity and use cases, although your use cases can vary and you can jump around. What we like to do is determine the right level of maturity for each individual use case. And again, it's going to depend on what your use case is, how it impacts your compliance, all the factors that we talked about for helping you balance to making sure you have the right level of readiness with the right level of maturity. And Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I think that your maturity level is determined by the use case that you have. I think you need to look at, you first say, how are we using it? And that's what's largely going to guide how you think about your maturity.
And again, doing it on the per use basis is much easier than doing the large one. A couple webinars coming up. You can register for those at the Contoural website. We think these are good content coming up. And we have a number of white papers, articles, additional content. go to our website, or if you just want to email us, hey, can you send me information about X? We can send you copies of stuff. That's pretty easy to do. We do want your feedback. We value your time. If you could please go take a look at the survey, and we'll give us feedback. What did we provide the information you wanted? Well, was it any good? Did we miss anything? We actually look at this very closely. Your time is valuable, and we want to make sure that we're providing valuable content. So give us, both the good and the bad. Let us know. We want to be able to do that. We're about out of time. I just want to say thank you to everybody. We wish you luck and success as you sort of go down this path of AI governance and readiness. Turn what feels a bit overwhelming now to actually a real service for your organization. Good luck and take care.